I'll read it out just for those listening to the recording later. So the Gone Grant, 31-year-old, the Glen 21-year-old, the Aberlour, 33, the Bladnoch, 34-year-old, the Springbank, 24, and the IslaySponge Bowmore, 20-year-old. Give it.
What were the first two, Ollie, in the lineup? Which order are we going in?
The Gone Grant, 31-year-old, and the Glen 21-year-old.
You.
No worries. Good to hear your voice, Garth.
I thought that would brighten your Wednesday, Ollie.
Thank you, mate. I appreciate it. I'll see you in the flesh on Friday. We've got a tasting on at Source Brewery. There's a few tickets left for those in Sydney. Whiskey and beers on a Friday night.
Oh man, sorry I can't be there. Source is one of my favorites.
Right, there you go. Cool. All right. Well, I might officially kick it off. A recording. All right. Emma sends her apologies. I've worked her to death. So she's asked for a night off, plus the Melbourne show and a few other tastings she's done back to back. So I will give her the night off, and instead we will celebrate by drinking probably the most intense / epic sponge lineup we've ever done to date. There've been some ambitious ones in the past, but when Chris put this one together, I think we sent it to Angus. He kind of said this is pretty cool. So regular housekeeping, don't drink and drive, pour your 6 whiskeys out. We run a poll at the end. Feel free to go back to your whiskeys throughout the tasting. We love your feedback, and any questions, whether for Angus, myself, or even your tasting notes, throw it into the chat. It's a pretty small group today, so depending on how we go on time, maybe you just I'll put your hand up if you want to unmute yourself if you prefer to ask it in the flesh. Otherwise, just put it into the chat. I think that's it for housekeeping. We've got some of these whiskeys still available for sale, so hit myself or Chris up. I'll share the link at the end as well. And obviously rewards members get a bit of a discount. I think most of you, or not all of you, are reward members, so you're all across that anyway. So that's the housekeeping. Officially, I think we're tasting number 4 or 5, welcoming back Angus MacRaild of Decadent Drinks to our wonderful Down Under tastings.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Ollie, for having me. It's always a pleasure for me to do these because it's nice to get kind of live, immediate feedback from all of you guys for the whiskies that we've been bottling, and obviously a lot of work goes into getting these products to the stage of being in glass and available on shelves. So it's nice to get feedback from the community and to have a chat with you guys like this. It's pretty cool. So, sorry. So yeah, let's start with the first round, which is, we've called it Gone Grant, which is kind of just a code for Caperdonach. So don't know if you know, in case some of you don't know, the Caperdonach distillery was built in 1965 as a sibling, almost like a carbon copy of Glen Grant, which at the time was, to service the blending requirements and the demands on Glen Grant spirit, which the main distillery wasn't able to supply. So they built this kind of copy of it over the road, and it was known as Glen Grant 2, formerly known as Caperdonach. But in the early days, it's interesting because Caperdonach and Glen Grant were very close in style up until kind of the early 70s. I think after that, they slowly started to drift apart a little bit, which is what makes this one really interesting. So this is, Caperdonach. It's a 1993, I believe. Single cask, single refill hogshead, and I'm just getting my details up on this one because I can't quite remember whether it's a hoggy or a barrel. Actually, I should be more on point on that. But yeah, it's a single refill cask and 31 years old, and natural low strength, 43.9%. And what I like about this whiskey is I think it's more old school than, in terms of flavor profile, than I would necessarily say of a lot of the Glen Grants from the same vintage, or same production era. Early 90s, Caperdonach seemed to be making a more kind of full-bodied, slightly more traditional style, and I think that shows quite well in this whiskey. I find it to be more focused around kind of waxes and kind of Hessian camphor, these sorts of typical old school kind of more distillate driven character flavor profiles that you tend not to find too often in Speyside whiskies from this production era. So I think it's pretty interesting. The reasons behind that, it's a bit speculative, but I think that because the blending demands changed and evolved, certainly dipped in the 80s, I think the purpose of Cappadonic as a distillery changed and became more like Glenkeith, for example, which was used a bit more of an experimental distillery or as a supply and demand distillery. For example, they made quite a lot of peated batches of Cappadonic. And in fact, we've got a cask of Cappadonic, hopefully almost confirmed, coming up in the next 6 months sometime, which is going to be from some of these peated stocks. So it's really interesting that they have these different, quite divergent parcels of whiskey made at one distillery. And so you know, from the 90s, Cappadonic becomes quite a different beast to what it was in the early 70s or late 60s, for example. And certainly quite different from Glen Grant, which was still producing over the road, of course. And then Cappadonic now is closed, was demolished in 2002. So it's a bit of a shame because it did make quite a characterful, divergent, interesting mix of whiskies. And this is a good example of that, I think. So yeah, I'm interested to see what you all think of that. And
whilst people throw in your tasting notes, this kit sold out so quickly, I didn't have time to actually put a kit aside for myself. We normally just put one across for Emma, and I went to like 10 minutes later after Chris sent out the email, and there were no kits left. So I need to live vicariously through your tasting notes, please. Really important. Otherwise, I don't know what you guys are drinking or if you're enjoying it or not. But I'm just reading on it. So this is a second fill barrel, matured full term for the 31 years. 2 questions. Is that common for that distillery at the time? And was it a refill from a previous distillery or the same distillery?
So that, I don't know. I certainly know that it was pretty common that most distilleries are filling this sort of cask type. I think what would much more likely happen is that casks would go to one of the central warehousing setups in kind of probably around Glasgow, central Scotland, there where the blending team would be located. Casks from all sorts of distilleries arrive, they get dumped, and then if those casks are deemed to be still usable, which in those days the view was that it was a much more generous view of what was usable than now, and that a lot of casks now would go and get rejuvenated because producers want wood activity. They want their spirit to be kind of flavored with wood. In those days, production wasn't as high, demand wasn't as intense. So the view was that, you know, refill was fine. Plain oak was fine. It was created older whiskies that were good blending components. I think there was a point in this era when they'd be filling these sorts of casks, second fill, refill barrels. And if they're young, that's when you start to get quite kind of grassy, plain spirits, because the spirits that went into them in the first place weren't necessarily as characterful as or as interesting as the distillate being produced 20, 30 years previously. But there's a sweet spot in the 90s where the distillate's being filled into these sorts of casks, and then if they're left for this length of time, 30 plus years, that's plenty time for a cask like this, which is relatively inactive, to still mature and round out and create a really elegant, beautiful, mature whiskey. This to me is a kind of profile which I would class as like among my favorite go-to types of whiskey, which is not too sweet, pretty characterful, still with good like distillate derived characteristics, which I would term as like, you can taste the raw ingredients, this kind of barley cereal character. It's got this nice waxy fattiness about it, which I love. And there's a sort of just a touch of fruitiness and honeyness underneath there, a little bit of exotic fruit as well. That to me is really like good, characterful, mature Speyside malt whiskey flavor profile, which is not too common now, and which is a style which some people might say is a little bit standard or common, from back in the day. But actually, I love it. I find it extremely pleasurable and easy to drink. To me, and also the fact this is a naturally low, approachable cask strength. It's a whiskey that's about pleasure and easiness and approachability and kind of simplicity. But to sort of return to that question, Oliver, yeah, I don't know if it was Cappadonic that was in it in previous fill. Could be could not be, but it is certainly a very typical cask type from that era.
Yeah, cool. Just reading some of the questions coming in. So, Michael, we got some fans for your Lego collection in the background there, mate. It's always ambitious. Your next project that I see that's happening. Love it. Michael said, beautiful nose on this one. A lot of tropical notes, as we just commented on. Green apple on the nose from Michael as well. And then more on the palate. Garth says, delicious, massive fan, light tropical, bit of spice. Rhett says, geez, that is good. So is this like the tropical, like any 30-year-old like Middleton or like an old Bunner or something, sort of like typical tropical that comes through? Is it a normal
I
tropical?
think it's probably, I think it's probably on a par with something like a Bunnahabhain from that era, or I wouldn't go as far as the Irish or Little Mill or anything like that. I think they take this tropical fruit thing to a greater excess. It's interesting people mention tropical because I do find that, but I don't find it to be the dominant component in the whiskey. I suppose when I think of tropical fruits, I think of things like Bowmore and yeah, Irish whiskies or Old Longhorns. I think they, so maybe my like tropical fruitometer is a bit kind of skewed in one excessive direction. I find in this that there is a tropical element, but it's nicely balanced by, yeah, stone fruits that someone just mentioned there. So kind of more broad spectrum fruitiness that incorporates green fruit, orchard fruits, garden fruits, white fruits, all these sorts of things, and just creates this kind of like fruit salad medley of pleasurable, easy fruitiness. And that combined with these kind of slightly firmer, waxier tones that give structure. I think that's what I find very attractive about this whiskey. For me, it's a whiskey that works really well on the nose as well, and it works on the palate, but because of the low alcohol, it makes it extremely drinkable, which it becomes. So in one sense, it's one of those whiskeys where you should pour a big dram into a really elegant nosing glass and pour another big dram into a tumbler. And you nose the nosing glass all night and take large mouthfuls from the tumbler. And that will give you the perfect combination of ways to enjoy this whiskey. Yeah, so
without 15 ml samples.
Yeah, hard to do with 50 ml samples, but this is why it's important to buy a whole bottle and and open and drink it, and to have an excessively silly glassware collection at home. This is all good reasons.
All of us here are big fans on testing out glassware. But I might, because we're conscious of time, I might jump straight into whiskey number 2 because I have a feeling we're going to want to spend like an hour on the last 3 whiskeys. So we might, yeah, jump into the Glengarry 21-year-old.
Yeah. So Glengarry 21. Again, this is another just straight up single cask. And this was, yeah, a 2003 Glengarry, 21 years old, cask strength. And again, I believe this was a first fill hogshead this one had matured in. So not first fill barrel, but first fill hogshead. So cask staves that would have come over from America having been used to mature bourbon and then remade into a 250-litre hogshead instead of a 200-litre standard barrel, which is a really clever cask type because you do get, as you'll notice on this, you immediately get the richness and the sweetness of the wood, but it's tamed. I think there's a more harmonious balance between ratio spirit to activity of wood, which I think preserves a lot of the inherent distillate character. Glengarry has always managed to be quite a characterful, full-bodied distillate. And I think it's a shame to smother that distillate with too much wood. And what I loved about this cask was that it gets the balance right. I think you get the right age, the right level of wood activity has led to the right level of maturity, roundness, concentration. So this is a much sweeter dram, much more sort of full-bodied, robust whiskey, obviously a good, healthy cask strength. But I love the natural sweetness. And again, talking about fruit and exotic fruit, to me, this one really does start to display kind of modern tropicality, where I start to think of things like mango puree or mango chutney or something like that, and this kind of like concentrated syrupy exotic fruit, or like the pooled juices you get at the bottom of a fruit salad. And I talked about fruit salad in the last one, but it's an impression I often get with these sorts of whiskies. So the Glengarry, I love it because you've got this kind of full-bodied fatness, which is typical of that Glengarry Highland style, wrapped up in a slightly more modern take with this kind of nice, juicy, sweeter cask influence, but it never leads or strays into excess. So you've always got that balance. So I really like this. I think be interesting to see what you all think of it. But it's quite a step change from the Capradonic, and I hope you see why we thought it would be better to do this one after the Capradonic, even though it's younger.
I was just going to ask, because what's the inspiration with this label? Because for those of you who aren't following, Decadent Drinks, obviously, WhiskySponge itself is a bit of a satirical play on the industry, with Angus's blog and everything. But this particular bottling, it looks like you've been cutting out some or doing some sort of stencil work or even wordplay there. What's kind of inspiration of this label?
Sometimes we do labels which are a direct reference to the whiskey, and sometimes it's more that we've got ideas, or I've had ideas that I want to do, and when I get a label or when I get a product where I think, this is a little bit of a blank canvas, we've got a slot here where we could do something a bit unrelated to the whiskey, and that's more about just playing with art styles. So with this one, I asked my artist Kat to do a collage, and I gave her a load of ideas of things she could include or textures. So she made a physical collage and then scanned the collage, and that became the label. So so really it's just a way to play around with different approaches to doing the label. Like, our philosophy is that, we're doing something in theory which is very simple. We're taking whiskies and putting them in mass-produced standard 70 cl bottles. So you've got to look for the space within that process to be creative. And to me, in this day and age, when you're doing a very competitive industry, being creative with the labels is absolutely essential. And so we're constantly trying to think of different ideas that we can use. Or I ask my artists, are there styles or specific artists or specific approaches that you'd like to try? And with this one, it was just I had in the back of my head for a while, it would be cool to do a collage and see if that would work. So it was a bit of an experiment, and I think it worked well. I like the result of this label, and I think it's kind of it's pretty fun. And then the back label, we did something that was more specific to the whiskey, which was we did the same, just more subtle approach, and just did a visual tasting note with a load of cut up pieces of fruit and made a little fruit collage, which was, it's intended to represent the whiskey more explicitly. So yeah, that was the inspiration, really. It was just trying to play around with a different approach to doing the label art. Because normally our art is fairly traditional. It's either digital kind of cartoony style, or it's hand-drawn physical artworks which are then scanned. And this is one where I just thought, let's try and build something a bit more physical and see if that translates.
I like the googly eyes as well.
Yeah, that was very early on. It was like, if we're going to do that, we have to have googly eyes. So, and we'll probably do this again in the future. I'm not sure what yet, but I think we'll almost certainly do more collage things like this, because it worked well. I always wanted to do one of these magic eye ones, but I haven't been able to find an artist that can do magic eye labels yet. I think it would be quite a good way to put something pretty rude on a label and sort of technically get away with it.
Oh, we've seen some with the 3D red and blue glasses. A few of them have been done as well. So yeah, there's ways around it, I guess.
Oh yeah, definitely. There's always, where there's a will, there's a way to break the rules, I've found. Yeah.
Like,
so what's people's thoughts on this one then?
Cigar says like a bag of lollies, tasty. Michael says a concentrated version of the first whiskey, which is interesting. Much more stone fruit. The other Michael says on the palate, slightly oaky background, apples, pears, etc. A bit of lychee bitterness. Bobby says syrupy and lychee. So there you go.
Yeah, that's cool. I also got lychee on this when I was trying the Cask sample and thinking about it. Yeah, no, I agree with all those notes. The whole thought of a more concentrated version of the first whiskey, that's quite a good observation. I hadn't thought of that before. I would tend to agree with that they're similar in profile in some ways. Similar in sort of like base spirit, but at different ages and treated by different wood types. It's quite a good way to think about it. Yeah, so again, I really like Glengarry. It's always been a whiskey I have sort of looked for casks of, and we've got another one. We've got a second cask of this, which we'll do in a couple of months' time. So, and then after that, I don't know. We'll almost certainly do more Glengarry because it's one of the remaining distilleries I think that still makes quite charismatic whiskey. How has the distillate changed since the pre-mid-90s? I mean, Glengarry famously used to be pretty heavily peated up until 1975, and then after that time, it went through a bit of a weird no man's land era, which was very similar to Bowmore, and they were in the same group company, which would make sense because it was probably a kind of production ethos problem. But lots of batches are very soapy, and you can get some which are very excessive, like soap or Parma Violet. That was a problem that Glengarry had in the 60s as well, occasionally, but far less excessively than in the late 70s, 80s. When it's good, after 1975, it's just very fat, waxy Highland style distillate. In the 80s, you got some batches which were perfumey, soapy, as I said. And then it sort of emerged from that around 88, 90, same time as Bowmore. Both distilleries improved dramatically around that time. And after that, you started to go back to this kind of like full-bodied, kind of Highland style profile, quite waxy, quite mineral, quite cereal, quite robust. And it's a profile which it's never really totally lost. It's always managed to kind of just about cling on to that. It's not as sort of full and obvious nowadays as it was, I would say, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not coming back, because I think that the owners, Beam Suntory, have made quite a big deal of going back to a lot of more traditional methods at the distillery that they've put back in floor maltings. They are doing a lot of work around fermentation, I believe. So I think Glengarry is going to be one to watch in the coming decade, based on what they're doing and the changes they've kind of brought in. And we did some really beautiful bottling of Glengarry, actually. When I think back on it, there's actually quite a few. Like it was a 1990, 1988, 1991 that had 20 years in a port cask. Though these are all great bottlings that I was really pleased with.
Even your recent Equinox and Solstice you did with it was great.
Yeah, that was lovely. I think it was a summer last year or something. We did a couple of refill barrels of 2011 mixed together, and that was yeah, that was really good dram. That was really, like, we've still got a couple of casks from that parcel, and I should probably revisit them at some point. They were great whiskey.
Glengarry is not that commonly seen here. I think maybe one or two other IBs may have done some in the past, but yeah, we had to convince people to give us your glass at festivals to try. But once people tried it, they're like, "Oh, this is actually really cool." So yeah, so again, this is half the reason we get into IBs is they try distillate we haven't never heard of here sometimes.
Are the official bottlings? I presume the official Glengarry is available over here, over with you.
Not that I'm aware of, and
Really?
yeah.
Oh wow, interesting. I find that quite surprising, really. Oh well, that's good to hear. If you ever want to do, well, I'm sure we could in the far future, once you've sold your Ben Nevis, we could look at doing a Glengarry for Oz if there was an appetite. Shall we do dram number 3?
Yes. Let me just add this person to the room. So the dram number 3 is the Aberlour 33-year-old. And again, I can't recall of another IB I've had recently that's had Aberlour in Australia. I know this must have been quite rare for you. Was it your first?
It's our first Aberlour, yeah. It's hard to find, and there's not that many. There are some IBs that have it, and there are some younger ones, but the younger ones are not generally that impressive in my view. But there are Aberlour casks kicking about. We were lucky; we bought these from a private cask owner. A lot of the best stuff we find is from private cask owners, and we have been reasonably lucky in that we've got quite good, between me and my business partner Ian, and our general sort of involvement in the whiskey world, we managed to shake loose a few good casks over the years. Obviously, our Springbanks are kind of the most obvious example of that. But the Aberlours were also from a private cask owner, which means they're quite unique. So these are not casks that you're going to find at any other indie bottler. You won't find sibling casks of these at any other indie bottler, for example. And Aberlour is pretty interesting because it doesn't behave, in my view, like other Speyside malt whiskies. This is quite different from the Caperdonach. I think that it's quite different from things like the Burnside we've just bottled. People think of old Speyside whiskies like this, and they might think of it as just directly being very honeyed, very green fruit, very sort of sweet. And I really like this combination of these two casks. So this is one of the, I think it's the only one in the lineup which is a sort of had decadent drinks treatment, where we've created a small batch out of a couple of different casks. So it's a 1989 refill hogshead mixed with a 1991 refill hogshead, I believe. And we left these two casks to stew together. So we put one of the casks in on top of the other. I think we put the 91 in on top of the 89 and left them to just marry for a while. And then we bottled it at natural cask strength. So obviously cask strength is just under 50% at 49.7. So it's a nice good cask strength. And the marrying time helped them integrate. And the 1991 was a bit softer and a bit kind of more towards the Cappadonic style, sort of waxier, drier, whereas the 89 was kind of more excessively sharp and fruity and tangy. And each cask felt like it had something that the other one needed. That's usually the reason we do these mixes, these little multi-vintage mixes, when we mix two different casks of the same distillery. It's because each cask has a great quality on its own, but also an absence that the other cask can deliver or fill. And so mixing them together, in my view, created, and this is always the case when we do these sort of little batches, is the combination of the two is greater than the sum of its parts. So you make a better whiskey than either of them individually by mixing them together and combining them. So that's the approach we frequently take with these sorts of bottlings, and this is what happened with this Aberlour. And I was just really, first of all, I was really chuffed that we managed to source an Aberlour of good age, and I really liked the profile. I think it's got a fruit profile and a kind of lightness about it, and a level of complexity that is really interesting, really rewarding. I think it's quite different from a lot of other, as I said, other contemporary Speysiders at that age. And I think it's a very entertaining whiskey. It's a whiskey that you could spend a lot of time on the nose, a lot of time sipping away at, and I think it often reveals different facets of its character. I think it's a whiskey you can return to many times, and you'll often find something different. And barbecue pineapple, yeah, I would agree with that. I think there is an element of tropicality again, but I think there's also a kind of a sharpness and almost a level of, I would almost say acidity in there sometimes as well. There's a freshness about it, which I think is uncommon for a 33-year-old malt whiskey. So yeah, I'm very curious to see what people think of this, because I am quite fond of this bottling. And one day I hope to do a tasting which is just like a selection of all the, maybe not all, we've done quite a lot of them now, but just do a tasting focused on the small batch bottlings we did, where we mixed things together and made potions. So yeah, and I'm
always fun.
interested.
I was just going to ask a question to everyone, actually. I imagine most people's exposure or understanding of Aberlour in Australia is like myself early on in my whiskey journey, the 12-year-old, and then the Abuna at some point for that cask bomb, cask strength sherry bomb. And this is definitely not that, from what I'm reading and what I'm listening to.
Yeah, this is a very far removed whiskey from Aberlour Abuna, that's for sure.
So stunning finish. Michael S says, with Michael T agreeing, barbecue pineapple, as James said before. Gus says, loving these traditional big sherry cask whiskies, showing their spirit more. So good. Honey from Howard. So I'm
yeah, I definitely agree with that. I'm always looking for whiskies that are very clear examples of their more traditionally sherried makes. Like we've done this with Dalmore. What else? Jura. We're about to do a Jura, which is like completely bone dry, naked 30-year-old Jura, which is gorgeous. Yeah, I love finding these sorts of whiskies that defy popular expectation or opinion about them. That's part of the fun and part of the purpose, I think, independent bottling.
Which leads us to whiskey number 4, the Bladnoch 34-year-old. And to that point, Bladnoch is quite decisive, or divisive, I should say, in Australia. I think some people really like it, some people don't. Very curious what people think of an IB bottling, especially at this age. But yeah, keen to hear more about how you came along this one.
Yeah, so this was a parcel of casks that I knew existed, because the person we bought it off, I'd sort of talked to them about it for a while, and so it's a single refill barrel of Bladnoch, but it had previously been from a parcel of quite sort of other refill barrels of Bladnoch, which were combined some years ago and put back into the same casks. So that's why there's quite a lot of bottles and why the strength has been retained quite well. And it's also why I think this has this particular profile, which is really concentrated. And you again, you're taking a kind of a screaming handbrake turn away from the Aberlour and going more towards, back towards like a fruit bomb, a honey bomb, a fruit bomb profile whiskey. And this one really does have, I think, quite a clear combination of tropical and citrus fruits in it. I always think of Bladnoch as being about citrus and grass and butter and this kind of lowland lightness, which is quite typical of, I think, what people think of as lowland whiskey, even though it's not always accurate in my view. But Bladnoch embodies that almost more than any other. And certainly Bladnoch from this era, from the kind of 80s, early 90s, before it was closed for a while. So I knew about this parcel of casks. I knew they were excellent, and I was happy to be able to get one. So we did a little bit of tinkering with this one, where we pulled out 50 bottles and did it as a special 33-year-old bottling last year. And we left the rest of the whiskey sitting with much more headspace for another sort of 6-7 months, whatever it was, in cask, and then did it as this 34-year-old. And that extra time only magnified that fruitiness, because I do think one of the things that helps whiskey, especially when it's old, is air and just exposure to air. And I think pulling a bit of volume out of the cask helped the rest of it magnify that fruitiness even further. So yeah, very pleased to have been able to do this one. I think it's gorgeous whiskey. I personally love Bladnoch. But when I say I love Bladnoch, I don't know the modern stuff too well. I certainly love Bladnoch, and what I think of as Bladnoch is this whiskey from this era. And there's something about the 1990 Bladnochs that seem to be extremely sort of robust, in the sense that they have a lot of stamina in cask. They seem to retain their fruit, their freshness, and their vivacity, for many years, 34 years in this case. So I really like the concentration. I like the length in the mouth. I love the fruit character, which seems present at every stage. So yeah, I mean, I like it. I don't know why Bladnoch is so divisive in Australia, but I hope some of you like it. I hope at least 50% of you like it.
Yeah, there's I think there's been a couple like single cast releases or something that just didn't work, and it's built a reputation around it, and people will just maybe, I don't know, maybe because it's the Aussie owner who sold his yogurt business, and I don't know what the story is. But yeah, I've had some good ones over the years. I think one of the Society ones that's in Rockpool Bar and Grill, I don't know if it's still there, fantastic whiskey again, and it's that 91 or 92, I can't remember. So, there are some great, but yeah, that's the old style, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny we think about 1990 as being old style, but then it was quite a long time ago. 34 years to be precise. It's terrifying. Yeah, so we have another cask of this, which we'll probably do next year, I expect, when it's 35 years old. Fingers crossed. So we'll see how that one compares, but it's of the same kind of character as this one. So yeah, this is a whiskey which to me is just one of these ones that you can just pour a big dram of and get lost in at night, pour and just spend time nosing and sipping away. And yeah, very, very pleasurable whiskey.
Looks like we've got some fans in the room. So simply
Oh,
brilliant,
that's
Jared.
that's good to
Michael
hear.
says, very different to the first three, but interesting to drink. Michael also says, so good. Finish just keeps going. Palate flavor I find is different to the nose. James says, much longer finish. Michael says, chewier in the mouth. Bobby agrees. Nose is very delicate. It's building. There we go. Surprisingly light for the age. So yeah, got some interesting. So fresh for the after
Okay.
34 years.
All right, good. I agree with most of those comments. Thank you. Should we do drum number 4, is it?
5
Or
now.
5? 5. Are we on 5? Yeah. Um, yeah, dram number 5 is another one that will require a bit of patience and attention. That's another good point. Drinks way lower than the stated ABV. Yeah, it is very easy. And I think the point of good whiskey, even at cask strength, is that it should be easy. Now that's not true of everything. There are some like insane whiskies at 63%, which are amazing, but do need water. But broadly speaking, a whiskey at this age and this strength, I wouldn't bottle something like this if it felt like it was aggressive or harsh at this age. It needs to be immediately accessible. So I always think that's a good indicator of a quality whiskey. Right, Springbank. So yeah, I mentioned earlier private casks, and this is another good example of probably one of the best examples where we've been able to be successful in sourcing some privately owned casks, Springbank, and that's been the case of all the Springbanks we've bottled now. I think we've bottled 6 now, different Springbanks, including one Hazelburn, and they've all been private casks that we managed to secure. It gets harder and harder. These are really the only casks now in existence of Springbank at this age, outside whatever the distillery itself owns, because they stopped selling private casks in 2000, I believe, or 2002. And since then, obviously many have been sold or bottled, so it's a dwindling number of casks. Where has it been for the last 9 years? What's this? So this, this cask was first fill sherry, but 1999, fully matured at the distillery, and then we moved it, bottled it, and we did it as WestieSponge 3. So they have this series, this mini series, which there's going to be 5 of, which is designed to sort of showcase my affection for the West Highland whiskies in Scotland. I think whiskies on the West Coast are often a little bit overlooked, perhaps, or forgotten about, but I think they tend to be among the most charismatic. So I designed this series of 5 bottlings, which was meant to show modern, younger West Highlanders, all the way through to older, mature, sort of old style, traditional West Highlanders. So we started with a sort of young 5-year-old Knockneen and a young 5-year-old Raasay. The Knockneen was kind of more wood driven. The Raasay was very distillate driven. Then we did the Springbank, and we followed the Springbank up with a 95 29-year-old sherry cask Ledyig. And in August, we'll do the final bottling, which is a 1998 Ben Nevis. So it's a nice spread of whiskies, and it's a lovely series. I really like, probably one of my favorite things that we've done in terms of just style, presentation, artwork, execution, whiskies, everything. So yeah, this is 1999, first fill sherry butt, Springbank, 24 years old, natural cask strength. It's been very well received. Most people seem to like it. I really like it. I think it's a very robust, powerful, and evocative example of Springbank. I think it's got what you would want from Springbank of this age and this cask type in there, which is, it's very coastal, very fresh. There's good peat character, but balanced. And you have this lovely, quite leathery, tobacco-driven sherry cask flavor influence. Walnuts and sort of dry, peppery earthiness, and there's just a lot of things going on, but it all integrates beautifully. That's typical example of something that's sat in a good cask its entire life, where you've got roundness, you've got balance, you've got integration. So yeah, I think it's fantastic. Obviously, these are now unfortunately very expensive whiskies, and it's the only way to secure these things is to put them out at a high price point, which I would rather not do, but it's the unfortunate reality of the market and the fact that there's so few of these casks available anymore. So yeah,
There,
chewy tobacco, smoky, funky nose. Yeah, I agree with these notes. Yeah.
well, Rhett, you're ruined for life, mate. If that's your first Springbank.
Wow, yeah, that's quite a Springbank to try if that's your first. But yeah, welcome to the Springbank Appreciation Society.
My apologies. It looks like I've done a typo. It should be 99, not 91 on your little labels
Oh
there.
yeah, so yeah, it is a 99.
What I
Um,
was going to say is, I was telling Angus we cracked this for another event, so I don't know if people can see, but there's a liquid there. So this is a neck pour whiskey where it needed like 20 minutes to breathe when we first cracked it. I've just gone back to it now after 3 weeks, and it doesn't need it. It's already the aroma's like in the room with me here in the first 5 minutes. So you mentioned earlier these old whiskies need time and oxygen to breathe, and already in the bottle it's done that just in a few weeks.
yeah, it's definitely true that uh, like the neck pour of a dram is so often misleading when it's a whiskey that's as big and powerful and has got as much in it that needs unpacking as this whiskey does. So I found the same thing. I also have got a bottle open here, and I'm still going back to it and revisiting it. And much like I talked about with the Aberlour before, it's a whiskey that I kind of keep coming back to and finding something a bit different in it each time, and it reveals something different, which is again, I think, a hallmark of a really good dram and something I look for and I really appreciate in whiskey more broadly as a drinker more than anything else. Um,
You
so yeah,
Sorry, I
carry on.
was just going to say, you mentioned price. We sold out our first allocation like instantly, and I know we begged you for some more. Thankfully, you sent us some more, and we're pretty much out of that as well. I think there's 2 or 3 bottles left. This, for what it is on specs and purely on taste, and I know a few people have already rated it online, but like Ruben and stuff. But people in the Australian market are really enjoying this. There's been a few Springbank releases, like the Mickey Mouse, which just I think are taking the Mickey out of the price of what they're charging for it. And this is
Price
still
was the Mickey Mouse
affordable.
one? I don't know what the price for that one was.
Oh, it was something ridiculous. It was the one with they got the Mickey Mouse. Actually, I'll Google it in a second.
Yeah,
The label is
yeah, I
like
saw that.
for the Asian market or something, but it was ridiculous. And obviously a collector's item that's only going to be rinsed and repeat on auctions, which I'm sure there's a place for those types of whiskies. But this people are going to be buying this in Australia and drinking. And a few people like Bobby on the call, they've actually shared a bottle with some mates, and they've been drinking it and enjoying it already. So I think it's been very well fairly priced. It's not too expensive. Was my
Well,
feedback.
it's nice to hear you say. I mean, I fought very hard to keep these under a grand. I know it's not much under a grand, but I did the same with the 96 we bottled last year. Definitely with this one, and then we've got another one coming up. We've got another Sherry Butt 1998, which is going to be released soon. And to me, that's the best Springbank we've ever bottled. It's better than this one, and that's also going to be the same price. And again, it's a sort of long-standing battle I've got with these private cask individuals to find a deal or structure, and it's different every time. They each want something different. So trying to make that work so that we can put it out under £1,000 is sort of a big part of my negotiation in these situations. I agree specifically with that Mickey Mouse bottle thing. I don't want to be like dissing other bottlers or anything like that, but yeah, just putting out a Mickey Mouse label days or whatever it was, weeks or something after Mickey Mouse passes out
Probably.
of copyright. That to me feels a bit cynical and a bit cheap. And I'm aware there's other Springbanks out there at way higher four-figure prices for similar stocks, or in some cases stocks which are, I don't think, as good as what we've been able to secure. And that's fine. That's a decision that these companies have come to. I don't know how they're selling. They're still for sale, so I don't know that they're selling. In today's market, I'm battling to keep prices down because, as we've discussed before, today's market is not the market of 2 years ago, and consumer spending is different. And rightly, people are looking at pricing in whiskey and thinking, it's all a bit silly, isn't it? For me, as someone who's passionate about this liquid and about this product and wants to be able to keep doing it and keep putting out beautiful spirits, you can't do that if they don't sell. So Emma's recovered.
She actually asked me to ask a couple questions on her behalf, so I've just thrown it into the chat.
Yeah.
Welcome,
right,
Emma.
so
We're
that's
just getting
good
to
questions.
your questions.
Nice.
How broad is WestieSponge, the scope? Town, yeah.
Well, first of all,
questions.
first of all, what I'll say is it's a very good idea to do a boxed WestieSponge tasting set. We're going to try and do more tasting packs generally with decadent drinks, but it's got to wait until after our big kind of brand changeover, which is coming in August. And once that's done, then I'll get around to doing tasting packs. But the idea of a WestieSponge set is a very good one, so I will keep that in the back of my head and see if we can actually do that, because I like that idea. Questions from Emma. How broad is the WestieSponge scope? Campbelltown seems a long shot from it. Well, that's true, but they are all on the West Coast, Emma. The West Coast starts where I say it does and ends where I say it does. But no, the West Coast starts really anywhere sort of from Glasgow all the way up to, I could arguably have included Highland Park if I'd really sort of twisted it and looked at it from a certain angle. But no, so for instance, the scope for WestieSponge, if I kept doing it, could include anything from distilleries on the Isle of Lewis, all the way down to Loch Lomond. I probably wouldn't go further south than that. But that would be the kind of range. So it would include things like Arran, obviously includes Springbank. Springbank is comfortably on the west coast of Scotland. That's like,
or like the West Dongle of Scotland, I suppose.
Yeah, I had various conversations about, well, my team told me I wasn't allowed to include like the penis map of Mull of Kintyre on the label. So there were various iterations of this Springbank 99 label where we tried to get this whole balance right. Can we expect to see a Heelan bottling from the Isle of Harris soon? Well, I would love to do an indie bottling from either from Harris or from the Lewis distillery, Avengerib. But having been out there, I can tell you it's a mission to get out there, and it's even more of a mission to build the relationships required. And it's just bandwidth. I don't have the bandwidth to do as many of these missions as I would like to. Like French spirits, going to France, building all takes time for not as much reward as you need financially to justify doing these trips and taking time away from all your other projects. So it will happen at some point, but it's a long-term operation. Why the need for WestieSponge? There's no need. It's just that I'm from the west coast of Scotland, and it's my kind of spiritual home, and I love the whiskies off the west coast, and I wanted to do a series. A lot of the stuff we've done with Decadent Drinks has been quite geographical. We've done IslaySponge, OrkneySponge. We own the old Orkney brand. That's what IslaySponge has sort of become. And, so I love the sense of place that of the great whiskies of Scotland really give you. Ben Nevis feels like a chunky Highland Fort William distillery. I associate the flavor of Ben Nevis very much with, standing in Fort William, having a dram of Ben Nevis. I associate Highland Park very powerfully with Orkney. And of course, Islay. I mean, a really good Lafroig or a really good Lagavulin. If you've ever been to Islay, you cannot unpick the correlation between those two experiences. So even though this is not to say that terroir exists as a separate discussion and one we do not have time and I don't have energy to enter into right now, but there is definitely because it's flavor, and flavor is so tied up with memory, there is definitely a powerful illusory aspect to drinking good whiskey from Scotland, especially if you've been there, and even more so perhaps for me because I live here, I'm from here, and I've got long-standing sort of romantic memories and associations with very specific bits of our geography. So I like to try and reflect that in the work we do.
Is your new distillery on the east or the west?
In Perthshire. So it's just outside a town called Cooper Angus, which is in Perthshire. and about 25 minutes drive north of Perth itself. So it's comfortably in the Highlands, I would say. It's not East Coast specifically. It's much more kind of like Central Highlands of Scotland. And we'll make a spirit style which will kind of reflect that, and will probably be something of a combination of like Western Highland and Eastern Highland in profile.
Yeah, cool. How is the new distillery
We
progressing?
just broke ground last week. Immediately discovered some asbestos, so there was a small delay, but it's fine. We're making steady but sure progress, and production now scheduled probably to commence around about May 2025. So we had a bit of delay recently, which is just seems to I'm not too emotional about these things. It seems to me to just be absolutely standard when you're trying to construct a commercial scale distillery, that you will have delays and things will cost more, and there will be frustrations. But I think every stage along the road we get, fewer and fewer problems can arise, and we get more and more certainty. So yeah, we're at the stage now, the construction team on site working away. And thankfully we don't need to build a distillery from scratch. We just need to rework a couple of existing large agricultural buildings, and one of them will have our distillery, one will have our warehouse. So work is ongoing on that, and the really exciting stuff will happen in sort of October time, when we'll start to see all the stills and washbacks and the mash tun get craned in. And so yeah, we'll be out there with drones and cameras and capturing it all. Luscious raw marketing material for the future.
It's exciting.
It is very exciting, yeah,
I was
absolutely.
going to say, and you've touched on it briefly as well, and I know we have one more whiskey to get to, so maybe people want to pour whiskey number 6 while I ask this question very quickly. WhiskySponge is ending at edition 100. That's confirmed. Everyone's, I think, read about that. Can you give any teasers, maybe what's coming next, without sort of giving away the big reveal?
There's going to be a new series, and it's going to be, so we're going to basically just restructure our brands a little bit. So we're going to keep doing Equinox and Solstice. We'll keep doing Old Orkney in the background a bit. And the rest of our bottlings will have 2 new homes in which to go to. There'll be one series which is kind of like our top series, flagship series, which is just for whiskies and just for the very best whiskies we can find. So if in future we find more Springbanks, things like that, or things like this Bowmore, they'll be in this series. In fact, that 98 Springbank I mentioned, that's going to be the first bottling in this new series, and that'll be revealed in August. And then there's going to be another series that sits below that, which is going to be a home for all spirits, and that's going to be our kind of bread and butter everyday ongoing series, which will contain any rums, French spirits, whiskies that we find, and that'll go up to a certain price point for whiskies, and above that certain price point, certain rarity level, those whiskies will probably go into our new flagship series instead. All this is going to be revealed in lots of detail after we've got a special launch event on the 8th of August in Glasgow, and then after that we'll be doing lots of public chatter about our new series, launching some new products. And I think what's also important to point out is that although Sponge is being put to bed, Sponge will end at edition 100 officially. There's going to be a few tail end, tying up loose end Sponge bottlings over the course of the rest of this year, and there'll be a few more exclusives that are already in the works anyway that just take a bit of time. So by the end of this year, pretty much all WhiskySponge bottlings will have concluded, and we'll be well into the new series going into the following year. Our new sort of brand portfolio will be pretty much set and should be fairly sort of straightforward and easy to understand. And the core that sits at the heart of it, which is what we like to do as Decadent Drinks, which have fun, create original artworks, be a bit satirical, be a bit silly, all that stuff is still going to be there. All our new series that we're introducing are going to be still driven by the same sense of humor, same artists, the same originality and creativity, the same team, but it'll just be done in a slightly different way, and gives me as well, a chance to kind of creatively refresh and reset. What I didn't realize when I started planning this was that this is essentially aligned with the 5th anniversary of Decadent Drinks. So we did 5 years, did WhiskySponge, and now I think it's the right time to do something different for the following 5 years. And it's also an opportunity for us to kind of reset and re-implement a load of stuff that we've learned along the way. We knew nothing about indie bottling when we started, and now we've learned a fair bit, and it's a chance for us to kind of apply that learning effectively, is to sort of to have a little line in the sand and do something a bit different. So yeah, that's all I can say at this time. But watch this space, and there'll be some hopefully quite fun and exciting things coming in August.
Yeah, super exciting. I've had a preview. I'm not going to say anything. It's just I'm excited too. So and then the whiskey list will continue supporting Decadent Drinks in its new phase and what's coming. So there's some very cool things coming. So watch this space.
Yeah, and there's lots of good drams already identified. Like I'm working on a bottling plan which goes through to March 2025, and there's loads of great stuff. We're something we've worked so hard at over the years is supply and selection, and I think that's starting to come true for us in a good way. So and it's not just for like old expensive stuff either. It's it's really trying to, what a lot of the work I put into has been able to find really nice whiskies which we can put out under 100 quid and are still, I think, better and different from a lot of what's out there elsewhere. So it's that that kind of careful discernment and putting a lot of effort into selection and scheduling. A year's bottling plan like that sits at the heart of what we do, and that really is the core of what my role is. So that still continues. All right, final dram, Bowmore 2004, and again, just back to a single cask, single refill hogshead, Bowmore 2004. And like Glengarioch, as I mentioned earlier, Bowmore is a distillate and a distillery which have been on quite a journey in terms of character and quality over the years. It's a distillery which has probably made the best whiskey ever. In the 60s and 50s, Bowmore was producing, probably along with Laphroaig and maybe one or two others, what I believe to be the greatest whiskey ever made by humans. And in the 80s, it made some of the worst, made kind of like weird peaty perfume, although there were some good ones. And then since 1990, late 89, it's really been on a bit of a renaissance in terms of character. And there seems to be a really amazing period of production between about 97 and 2005 or thereabouts, where they just seem to like get in their tropical groove once again and make very fruity Islay whiskey. So I just, adore Bowmore when it's like this kind of combination of quite scented peat smoke. So it's not a peat profile like Laphroaig or Lagavulin. It's much more aromatic and more delicate and intricate. And it's drier and it's more coastal and it's more marine. And that combined with this kind of tropicality, and that tropicality comes on the nose, but it bursts on the palate here, and particularly on the finish. So I just think it's totally stunning whiskey, and it for me was a no-brainer to include this in our IslaySponge series. That's one caveat, by the way, I would maybe make about Sponge, is that we have this series IslaySponge, and the concept was to do one bottling from each Islay distillery. Some of them are easy to get, some of them are not easy, and some of them are nigh on impossible. So we've done 6 now. So this is IslaySponge number 5. IslaySponge number 6 was a lovely multi-vintage Kalila. If we could find in future a really good cask of Kilchoman, very, very difficult. Port Ellen, extraordinarily expensive, possible, but probably not possible at a price that is realistic. Or Lagavulin, named impossible, unnamed maybe. Those are the 3 where maybe I would still do them as an IslaySponge bottling in order to, grow the set. Because I love IslaySponge as well. I think again what we've done with design and the fun idea and the idea of conceptually having a really good example of each of the distilleries in this series is a lovely idea. So I'm really enjoying it, and I love this bottling. Love this whiskey. To me, this is a perfect example of modern Bowmore at its absolute best. Fruity, peaty, invigorating, fresh, complex, detailed, sharp, powerful, everything going on. I was also very pleased that we managed to do what I hope is quite an offensive label to Aston Martin and the distillery, because yeah,
I was going
this
to just
arc
jump in.
too.
For those who don't know, obviously there's a before Decadent Drinks and Whiskey Sponges and IB, there was a blog which Angus has been running for quite a while. I think he's been a bit busy to update it recently, but one of his most famous articles back in 2012 was Bowmore announces exciting new sex toy, and with the commentary, maybe you sit on it. So that's made it to the front label here. Was that was on purpose? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That was I just think it's one of the most ridiculous bottlings that's ever existed. And I thought, right, this needs a sponging. And then that sense of ridiculousness was carried through and inspired this label. I also think whiskey brand pairing with a sports car brand is just it's just so like I don't know what's been the point of the last few decades of railing against drinking and driving if you're going to pair a whiskey brand and a sports car brand. It just seems just nonsensical to me. Anyway, doesn't matter. It's a great whiskey, so I'm pleased you mostly all seem to be enjoying it.
I've just turned the poll on, so myself and Angus, we can see the results, and we will reveal them in the end. For me, I love this Bowmore. I've tried all the recent ones. The Rembrandt one that you did the label, the ship. This is way better. The previous one was that 18-year-old, that quite heavy one as well. I can't remember the guy shoveling the coal. Was that edition 50?
Yeah, so edition 50 and edition 74, I think, are both 2003 Bowmores, which are from refill sherry butts, and they're actually sibling casks. So we did one for edition 50 and then edition 74. They're both fantastic as well, but they're different beasts because they've got varying levels of sherry in the mix as well. I love both those bottlings as well, but the 20-year-old Bowmore, I probably edges it for me because it has this just absolute unvarnished tropicality and it's pure distillate. So you're really just getting this, not perfectly mature, perfectly rounded Bowmore distillate without any real active or obvious wood in it. That refill hogshead has done a beautiful, sensitive job of just bringing that distillate out of its shell. Exactly the sort of whiskey I love. So it's cool to see Springbank and Bowmore sort of, neck and neck, gosh.
I might give it 30 more seconds for people to vote. Is there any other final questions for Angus before we kind of wrap up? I know we're conscious of time, so I'll leave the voting going for a few more minutes. But yeah, any sort of final questions, throw it into the chat. Reading some comments, the not so subtle sweet peat really comes into the finish now, just beautifully. Bowmore favorite of the night. Just wash the label off an old still. Affordable Cooper's Choice Port Ellen. There you go. So that's maybe how
I thought of doing that. I have thought of doing that, but I don't know how I would kind of sell it to the world in a way that people would tolerate. I don't know. I love the idea of taking, say, 50 bottles of all different Port Ellens, marrying them together in a demijohn, and then rebottling that as IslaySponge. But I don't know. I feel like I would get like flack from the whiskey community that it would be cheating. I don't know. You tell me how you view that. I'd love to do it. It'd be great fun.
Best label ever, made an instant buy for me. So I was actually giving feedback. We've had so many people buy our Australian exclusive, the Ben Nevis with the guys from Elysium as well, featured on the giant Kitty Kong, which Emma has dubbed it. Emma, I don't remember the show that you referenced in the naming of that.
Yeah, so Kitten Kong is a reference to The Goodies, a very, very old school British program that my dad forced me to watch nonstop as a child, and I could probably sing the theme song from start to finish still today. But yeah, there was an episode called Kitten Kong, and it was just a giant kitten, and I was like, well, I mean, it's a cat, it's giant, it's that Godzilla-esque vibe, and why not?
Yeah, I've seen that episode of The Goodies, so I get the reference.
That's the short URL for anyone who wants to see all the new decadent drinks. We've actually just had a shipment arrive in the last 48 hours with some of the newest stuff as well. So I don't know if Chris has had time to put it online. So have a look. Obviously, if there's any particular bottle you guys are looking for, just send Chris, myself, or Emma an email, and we'll do our best to try and source it down. We've done that in the past. Angus sometimes goes, "Hey, there's a couple bottles. Another country maybe he's not taken their allocation or something." So we can
It's
only
always worth checking in with us. Always ask, because you never know what we've got knocking about.
let me share the results. And it's tough being the first whiskey of the night, a 31-year-old whiskey. I feel sorry for it, but the Glen, Aberlour, decent, Bladnoch, popular, and then the Springbank and IslaySponge a tie, which I was surprised because Springbank was winning for a while. So obviously it's people's first and second favorites, which is awesome to see.
No, it looks it's a good result actually. It's a bit more distributed than I would necessarily have expected, but I'm pleased everyone seemed to enjoy it, and nice to see positive feedback, and good.
Is there a favorite from your side, Angus?
Probably going to be quite boring and say that the Springbank maybe is my favorite as a whiskey on its own merit, but I would say that the Aberlour has also got a lot of funness from me, because it's one where we took quite a lot of sort of creative intervention in making it a product. That's the whole thing that I love to do, is make decisions, do things, undertake activities in the warehouse which are going to lead to a product being unique to us, and that you as consumers get to enjoy a bottling which would not otherwise have existed without Decadent Drinks' decision making and input. So that's why, but I suppose just on its own merits, the Springbank as a pure top quality dram would be my pick.
Yeah, awesome. All right. Well, if there's no other questions, I might call it a night. Thank you all. Angus, if you don't mind staying on for a brief minute afterwards, I will bid you all farewell, and we will catch up in the next virtual tasting. We'll sneak in at least one more before the year's end, at least to celebrate whatever's coming next. I imagine it's the next thing on the cards.
Yeah, no, that sounds like a good idea. Look forward to it. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thanks, everyone.